Welcome back to the Surf Mastery Podcast. Episode 107 is with Tiffany Joh. It's amazing to hear from Tiffany the lessons she learnt from being a professional golfer at such a high level. The level of coaching that exists in a wealthy sport like golfing is second to none, and how she applied those lessons to her passion for surfing. I'll leave it there because she does a self-intro in the beginning of this episode. So without further ado, I will fade in my conversation with Tiffany Joh.
I grew up in San Diego, which is like a great surf town. Unfortunately, I did not surf growing up. I think I lived like enough inland, like half an hour, that I was like too lazy to make it all the way to the beach. But yeah, I grew up playing a lot of instruments, not really much of an athlete. But in 1998, a woman named Sari Pak from South Korea won the US Women's Open. And she won it in like iconic fashion. Like her ball on the last hole almost went into the water, and she like took off her socks and her shoes and she waded into the water, and she ended up winning in a playoff. And pretty much the very next week, I picked up a golf club. And my parents didn't really play very much. So I was 12.
Yeah.
But yeah, and so now you see, and the only reason that our family was watching was because this was the first time that we saw a South Korean athlete on TV, like a female athlete. And so it was really inspiring for us as, an entire people. So the very next week I picked up a golf club, but my parents didn't really know anything about golf. But my dad was a professor at San Diego State University, and there was a free junior golf program right next to campus. And I think in his mind, he was like, perfect. This is like free babysitting. I can just drop off my kid and not worry about it during the summer. So that's pretty much what he did. And I ended up just getting more competitive through this free program, and then ended up getting recruited by a couple colleges, ended up playing for UCLA. And then after I graduated, I ended up qualifying for the Pro Tour and playing on the LPGA for 11 years, and then ended up retiring in July of 2021. And the very next week started an assistant coaching position at a D2 program in North County, San Diego. And then the last couple of years I've been working at USC, which is ironically like a big time rival of UCLA. And then this past month, I just took over a job as a coach for the U.S. national team. So that's my new gig now.
Oh, wow. That's an impressive athletic background and resume. Wow. And coaching now, that's awesome. Okay. So thanks for that. When did surfing come into the picture?
So it's actually a really interesting story. I don't know if you're super familiar with the way the LPGA tour works, but there's actually like a developmental tour, the equivalent of the QS, going into the world, like the championship tour. So straight out of college, I actually played on, it's called the Epson tour. So I played on the Epson tour for a year, and then ended up getting like partial status on the LPGA tour. So I was jumping back and forth. And in my mind, it's like the best way to mentally play your first year professional golf, because like you're just so grateful to be playing any given week, right? So I would go play in these developmental tour events and I would play well. And then it would just like translate automatically to the very next week when I played on the big tour. I ended up playing really well, playing my way to better status. And then my second year, I had full status and I played awful, like missed every single cut, like did horrible. And by the end of the year, so there's two ways to qualify to get your LPGA tour card. One way is to spend a year on that developmental tour, and the top 10 ranked players at the very end of the year get their tour card. The other way is to go to Q School, which is this like gnarly 2-week long high pressure tournament. And by the end of it, 20 women get their card for the following year. So knowing that I had pretty much played my way into a position where I was going to have to go back to Q School, I think I intuitively knew that I was super burnt out from the season and really discouraged. So I actually, at the very end of the season, before I had to go to Q School, I had like 2 months before I had to start getting ready for it. I actually booked this surf trip with Holly Beck, who's another guest that you had on your show. And so that was down in Nicaragua. And so I flew down there, left the clubs at home. There's no golf courses down there anyway. And I ended up just like learning down there. And then I came back, and right away got aboard and started going pretty consistently in the mornings, like driving the half hour to the beach. And then I got into this great routine where I would go and do dawn patrol. I didn't know enough about like reading the conditions. I just paddled out no matter what. And then I would come home, like eat some lunch, and then I would go practice in the afternoon. And then a couple of months after, I went back to Q school, ended up breezing through, got second. And I think ever since then, it's been like kind of part of my yearly routine that after the season is over, when we have some time, I just go do some epic, I call it a treat yourself surf trip somewhere. So,
Oh, cool. So how old were you when you started surfing?
so I had to have been, let's see, my rookie year I was 23. So I was probably 24, 25.
Yep. Okay. Do you think having that background as a professional athlete and golfer helped you to learn surfing faster than others?
I don't know if there were any like actual like direct ways that it translated, but I think there's something to be said for pursuing something that's really hard and really difficult to do. I definitely think that I haven't played a ton of other sports, but surfing and golf both have to be quite frustrating in terms of the energy and the effort that you put in and what like you actually get out of it. So I think it's that pursuit of something really difficult. So I do think that maybe that mindset really translated to help me maybe improve a little bit faster than a normal person.
So you got over some of the frustrations of surfing faster than others because it's similar in golf.
Yeah. And I think there's something about, maybe this is for all hobbies or sports, but I do think that the best way to improve is to be really consistent in both surfing and golf. I'll take the person who's paddling out for 20, 30 minutes every day over the person that every other weekend is putting like 6 hours in the water. Like there's something, I think, I don't know if it's something with like your brain, but something important that happens in between all these sessions. It was interesting that the way that I approached surfing was really similar to the way that I approach golf. I'm a big fan of like a bunch of mini sessions. Even when I was playing professionally, I would like break up my session or my practice sessions into 3 or 4 throughout the day. And I would go do something and come back because there's something about that back and forth that helped me process something.
Are you a golf nerd? Like, did you really nerd out about technique and get multiple coaches and dive right into it?
I'm not, and I've never been. I think one of the funniest stories is there was one off season where I had to get my clubs regripped. So I just went to just some random pro shop in the area and I brought in my clubs and the guys in there were so excited. And they're like, what's the kick point on this? What's the shaft flex? And I was like, I don't know. It was purple and I liked it, but which is funny because that's exactly how I am with surfing. Whenever we go to the beach and people are like, oh, what's the swell direction? Like, what's the wind? And I'm like, I don't know. It looks wet.
So, how would you describe your role as a golf coach? Are you not focused on the technique and stuff so much? Is it more about the head game or?
Yeah, I think at the college level, especially this new generation of golfer, they've been getting instruction. They've been doing fitness training since they were like 8, 9 years old. And they are so polished by the time they get to us that a lot of what we do is helping them manage emotions on tournament day, kind of helping them with some course management, like plotting their way through the course, just, like, all of like the little things. And I think the little details that at this level actually make a bigger difference.
Okay. So just felicitating them to get into the zone at the start of the
Right.
round. And do you use those tools yourself if the surf is particularly challenging and you're feeling the pressure or?
No, I mean, honestly, like I'm not really good enough to feel any pressure out in the water. I think, anytime I get out there and regardless of what happens or how many times I like, go over the falls or whatever, to me, it's just, I'm just so grateful to be out there. So I actually do think in a lot of ways, when I started surfing, it really helped my mindset in golf. At a professional level, you're always going to take things a little bit too seriously, but it was kind of refreshing to go do this thing that I was horrible at and still enjoy doing it. It's difficult being a retired professional golfer now because I still have these really high expectations, but I don't put in the time and the work to really meet those expectations. So pretty much every time I go out there, I'm pretty frustrated. But I think with surfing, like I'm always so happy to be out in the water that it was like a really great thing to try to translate into my golf game.
Interesting. So the sort of your casual approach to surfing helped you took some of that into your golf?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think surfing and golfing there's so many parallels, but one of them is oftentimes the harder you try, like the worse it gets. The more pressure you put into something, like the less, I don't know, flow you have or what have you. Sometimes it's with golf, one of my coaches when I was really young said the secret is to work on your craft like it's the most important thing in the world, but to compete like nothing matters.
Okay. So all of the hard work is done at the driving range, not when you're actually playing. Is that what you mean by that?
Yeah. And I think, or on the putting green or the chipping green. And I think a lot of the times when we're trying to figure out what drills or tests or games we're doing in practice, a lot of it is to just push ourselves to like the very edge of frustration, right? Not make it so difficult or so impossible to complete that you quit, but to really like push you to the edge of being really frustrated so that when you get onto the golf course, you're almost recreating that feeling and you know how to deal with it because you've practiced that before. So in a lot of ways, when people try to do putting drills or something and it's like a must make situation, they try to make it so there's as much pressure on themselves as possible. So when they come down to the last hole of the US Open and they have to make a 6-footer to win or whatever, they're like, all right, like all these emotions that I'm feeling, like I've practiced this and I've been here before and I know like the appropriate adjustments to make.
Mm. So you're giving yourself confidence in the practice.
Yeah. And I think everyone under pressure has some kind of tendency, right? So for me, I'm a very fast paced, energetic person. So if I'm feeling nervous, I'll start walking fast, I'll start talking fast, I'll start swinging fast. And in a lot of ways, that starts to mess up my rhythm. So in practice, if I put myself under pressure and I practice consciously trying to slow myself down just to counteract how fast I go, then when I'm under pressure in a tournament, I can be like, all right, I know what I do. I know what my tendency is. Like, this is how I'm going to adjust.
You mentioned music, and I saw on your Instagram a clip of you singing and playing guitar. It sounded amazing, by the way. You sing beautifully. Do you see parallels between music and golf and surfing?
A little bit. I think actually, in a lot of ways, my musical background kind of hindered my golfing development just
Really?
because, yeah, I think there's this aspect of music that's like, so I played like in the marching band, I was a concert pianist and played the violin as a little kid. And a lot of it was like, I'm going to perfect this. And then once it's perfect, I'm going to perform. Right. But
Mm.
a lot of golf, and I think what I see with a lot of this newer generation is they wait for things to be perfect before they take it to a tournament. But like your golf is never going to be perfect. Like, the Tiger was the best player in the world and he wasn't even perfect. He didn't play a perfect round of golf. So there's this attitude with, I think all athletes need to have, and it's, I'm just going to go out with whatever I have and I'm going to make it work. And I think it's a really difficult transition when you come from a musical background. So when I was a little kid, Yo-Yo Ma had this practice routine where, within a piece of musical composition, there's all these measures. So he used to have this, he called it like the 5-quarter drill. So he would play the first measure and then he would move a quarter over. And every time he played it perfectly, he would move a quarter over. But if he messed up once out of the 5 consecutive times, he would move them all back. And then he would play the first and second measure together, first and second, third measure together until he was playing through the entire composition 5 times in a row perfect, which is insane. It must have taken forever. But that's kind of the mentality you learn to have in music. Whereas sometimes I think with like surfing and golf, it's so condition dependent and it's never going to be exactly the way that you envision it. And you need to learn how to make adjustments on the fly and be okay with like messing up and recovering. I do think sometimes that like in a lot of ways they're different. I do think that all of those things, all 3 of those things require a lot of practice and that kind of is beneficial in anything that you end up doing.
Mm. I guess with music, it makes me think you were referencing a particular piece of music, not just music in general. And whereas
Right.
I guess golf and surfing in particular is more like a jam session. You're not
Right.
going into it with a particular way of playing or a song to play. You're just going in to be in
Yeah.
tune with the way the wind is on the course or the way the conditions are with surfing.
Yeah. I think in a lot of ways, like I think most athletics is probably more like improvisational, right? And I think this is maybe another parallel. I think a lot. So I came from like a classical background. So everything was like, you just go buy the book, you go buy like whatever the composer wrote for you. But I do remember when I was in third grade, I met this kid from Kentucky who taught himself like jazz improvisational piano. And it was so impressive. But he was telling me like, you put in all this work on the fundamentals, you learn all the scales, you learn all the like different chords. So, and then you earn the like kind of the privilege of having fun as you get to improvise. So I thought that was like a really cool thing because I think like I definitely see the same thing with surfing. Like I don't know a ton of maneuvers, but when I see someone who's really good and they have their floater, the cutback and everything, they put in a lot of work to get their fundamentals down so that when they go out, they can have a ton of fun and be like very like improvisational in the water.
Yeah. Yeah, I've always thought surfing is like improvisational music. Whereas if you wanted to play that way, it's still important for you to practice your scales and do your ear training and understand your instrument and etc. But the reason you're doing that strict practice is so that you can jam and improvise, not necessarily to
Right.
perform a piece perfectly. And that's where I maybe see the analogy between music and surfing.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, because most people don't approach it that way, but I think you see that in golf, right? You see people put the time and the hours in practicing their swing and all the different clubs at the driving range, etc., so that when they do go out and play on the course, they don't have to necessarily think about it. They just play the game.
Right. For sure.
Mm. You mentioned that there were a lot of parallels between surfing and golf. What comes to mind, and why did you say that?
I think just like exactly along the lines of what we're talking about, this like balance of like technique, but then also like feel, right? And a lot of mental coaches in golf talk about like when you should be working on technical things and when you should just go completely on feel. And the consensus is that before in the weeks leading up to a tournament, there's a certain line, and everyone is maybe a little bit different, where you like work really hard on your technique, but at a certain point, once you're in the midst of competition, you throw it out the window and you just have to react. It is actually funny. So I think I'd only been surfing for maybe 2 or 3 years, and I was just learning to like paddle into waves and go down the line, but I was super into it. And I had a friend that played on tour with me who came down to San Diego to visit all the club manufacturers in the area. And then we went and played Torrey Pines. And afterwards, I looked because La Jolla is right there. And I was like, the shores looks fun. Do you mind before we get brunch if I just paddle out for 20 minutes? And she's, yeah, sure. I'll just sit here and watch. And I got out of the water and I was like, what'd you think? And she was like, you love surfing. You invest so much time and money and energy. And I thought you'd be a little bit better. And it was like such a dagger to the heart. But my
Ouch.
response was, imagine if imagine if someone was trying to learn how to hit a golf ball for the first time, but every time they wanted to hit it, they had to sprint from 40 yards away, beat 6 other people, and then the ball might move somewhere else. Imagine how long it would take to get better because you don't have any opportunity to ingrain any type of muscle memory or whatever. So in my mind, I was like, that's what surfing feels like to me. It feels like I'm just paddling around, just like trying to get an opportunity to get to my feet. And a couple years later, when we played an LPGA event in Hawaii, I got my payback because we paddled out to to like canoes or something in Waikiki, and she got a firsthand glimpse of how hard it was to learn how to surf. But I do think that it's similar in that respect, right? You almost feel like you have to like earn your like right to things. And I think golf at least is semi accessible at times because you can just go to a driving range. But like to go out to a golf course and to play with other people, it's pretty daunting. And I think for a long time, I didn't really appreciate enough people who started golf late in life because I was so young that I don't remember this beginning stage of, having to put in 4 or 5 years to get good enough to feel confident to actually go out to a golf course and play. But having done that on like the surf side, I'm like, okay, now when I go to the driving range and I see some 30-something-year-old woman learning for the first time, I'm like, I understand.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I guess golf is quite similar to surfing in that way. Especially, you think it might take you 4 hours to play 18 holes, but each shot only lasts what, half a second?
Yeah.
So there's actually not that
And it
much
only takes,
golf. It's lots of walking.
yeah. Yeah. It's a lot of walking. It's a lot of like cussing and drinking for some people, but it's definitely, and it's the same with surfing. I'm like, how much time did I actually spend surfing? Like 40 seconds today? Like, I think most of it was just sitting there. And I do think the other reason why it attracts the same personality though is it's whatever you want to get out of it, right? So it can be super introspective and personal, and it could also be really social. And
Mm,
I think at any given point in time, depending on your mood or at what point in your life you are, like it can change, right? So, I mean, there were times when I played golf only because I was trying to get better and I was just trying to like improve my game. I had no desire to compete. I had no desire to like interact with other people. And I was just in my own little cocoon. And then there's other times where I don't even care about any of the technique or getting better. I just want to go and walk around a golf course for 4 hours with my buddies and have a good time. And I think surfing to me is really similar, where sometimes I just want to paddle out alone. I want to like try to find a little shoulder to myself and not talk to anyone. And I want it to be really personal. And then there's other times where I just want to be out in the water with a bunch of my buddies, or in my case these days, like sitting in the parking lot drinking coffee and looking this way at the waves. But there's something like that can be inherently really social or really personal, depending on what you're looking for that day.
yeah, that's a great golf surfing analogy. So true. Yeah. I certainly have gone through stages where I've so focused on getting better, and then other times it's loosey goosey and just going with the flow. And I think both of those types of sessions inform each other. Have
Mhm.
you gone through stages like that when surfing? Like have you had any surf coaching done at all?
Um, so I actually, well, this is another guest on your pod. Rue Hill has this surf retreat
Yeah.
called Surf Simply. And the second year I was surfing, that was my off season trip. And he just completely, him and his coaching staff are insanely amazing in everything they do. They're like absolute unicorns, but they just blew my mind with like the technical aspect of it. And they film everything. They do like lectures, and as much as I think on the surface I maybe act very mellow and I don't really care about the technique. Like at my core, I still want to get as good as I can, regardless of what level I end up being at. That actually was really motivational because I ended up making a couple friends locally, and this is our big COVID activity. Is we would, since no one was really working, so we would go to the beach and we would trade off at a camera I would put on a tripod, and
Yeah.
so everyone would do like 20 minutes at the camera, and then afterwards, not that we really even knew what we were looking for, but we kind of had an idea of what looked good and what looked bad. And so afterwards, we would grab a couple breakfast burritos and we would laugh at each other's wipeouts, and then also try to start to critique each other, like why we bogged a rail here, or why like this, we didn't, complete this cutback. And doing that was so helpful because it's kind of like listening to your voice on an answering machine. It's
Mm,
never quite what you think it is in your
yep.
mind. So it was really helpful because in golf, we talk a lot about feel versus real. So feel, with everything you do, if you're trying to make some kind of change in your golf swing, you have to exaggerate it, because when you bring it up to full speed, it's not going to be as much because your body wants to keep doing the same thing it's been doing. And then when you get into competition, you're automatically going to revert back to what you're used to doing. And so if you look at some of the PGA Tour and LPGA Tour guys and gals, when they're like doing their practice swing, it looks grotesque because they're trying to exaggerate a specific movement because they know once I speed it up. And I think that's a lot of what I learned with the coaching at Surf Simply, and then also filming ourselves and then watching it back later. Because if you watch it right afterwards, you have an idea of like, this is what it felt like. I cut back all the way to the whitewater. And then you look at it and you're like, but I didn't. So maybe the next time I have to like really exaggerate that. And I think that's one of the things that Rue and his team taught me is you got to do something like too much. You got to overdo it and then find the middle ground from there. And that was just like so helpful to me as I tried to figure out how to do this whole surfing thing.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I like that. Do you remember Happy Gilmore?
Yeah.
Chubbs? It's all in the hips. Is that true?
All in the hips. Yes.
Okay.
And I had no idea, but surfing is true.
Yeah, the center of gravity, center of mass, I should say. Yeah.
I think anything where you're mixing up like weight shift and rotation, like hips have got to have a really big part of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I see a lot of similarities between good surfing technique and good golf technique.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's certainly something noticed looking at your Instagram, the way you surf, you don't really have a poo stance, which is great. And that might be just because you're so used to, because a golf swing stance is quite an upright stance.
Yeah. Well, I think like if you look at anything athletically, I kind of never understood like the really side on, like, I think we call it tacoing because you're all bent over and folded over, because like in golf, you're always like, the biggest thing is regardless of what's going on here, you're really engaging with your target. And so if you're not kind of squared off looking at your target, then like I've seen two types of golfers, the ones that maybe everything looks messed up from here, but they're always like looking out towards like the flag or the fairway or whatever they're hitting to. And I'm like, that guy's got a chance, you know? But the one who has like complete blinders on and he's just looking at the golf ball and isn't really even connected to his target at all, that guy, I have no idea where that golf ball is going, regardless of what's happening technique-wise with this golf swing. I actually have a funny story, another golf surf parallel. So I was playing the Scottish Open, and this was maybe like the best round I ever had when I was playing on tour. But at the time, I was kind of struggling with my putting. And so my putting coach, who's this Canadian guy, came out to the Scottish Open, and he's looking at my stroke and looking at the way I was reading everything. And he was like, everything looks really solid. You just look really disconnected from your target. And so he was kind of giving me all these like metaphors in sports of people like being really engaged with their targets, like race car drivers and all that stuff. And I was like, none of these are landing. And he's like, okay, surfer girl. He's like, who's your favorite surfer in the world? And I was like, it's got to be Steph Gilmore. Like, she's amazing. And he's like, okay, give me a second. And he goes on Google Images and he pulls up this image of her doing like a backside bottom turn, and she's looking up at the lip, and everything is like looking up at that lip. And he was like, if you're like so focused on what's going on right in front of you and you forget about the target you're going to, like, he's like, you don't stand a chance. And so we ended up doing a lot of like visualization stuff where we took, like a chalk pen and we drew out all these dots on the green. And then I would basically just like roll balls over them and didn't hit a ton of putts. I was just kind of doing a lot of visualization stuff, and then went out the next day and just putted out of my mind, like had one of the best putting rounds of my life. And that's like, I don't know if it was like a direct result of that, but I do think it made a really big impact on me to like, regardless of what I'm doing, to like never forget where the target is and where I'm going.
Yeah. So when you actually hit the ball, are you looking at the ball in that moment?
So yeah, I think like when you take it away, like you are looking at it, but you're not really focused on it. You're just trying to swing. But there are a lot of professional golfers who, when they putt, don't look at the ball and they look at the hole because like the stroke is so short. Like surely you're not going to miss the ball with a stroke that's like, a foot long. There's a lot of people who, when they really start to struggle with like gauging the speed or how hard they have to hit it or something like that, then they try to get themselves as target oriented as possible.
Interesting. So as part of that, do you sort of open up your peripheral vision? Is that part of
Yeah.
it?
So I think for me, when I putt, like my eyes are kind of going towards the ball, but I'm actually looking at a spot a little bit in front and I'm just trying to roll the ball over that spot. Because when you're putting, you're reading a lot of break. So you're trying to figure out like, is this, and then I like to kind of like pick a spot and roll it over that spot, but also keeping in mind like where the hole is as well. So I look like I'm looking at the ball, but I'm actually not really focusing there.
Interesting. Hmm. So I guess it's kind of like, have you ever learnt to juggle?
Not really, but I think I
Well,
know
you don't look at your hands, right? You kind of look up,
right.
and you should see where the ball is coming, and you should sort of know where your hand is and where the ball is going to be. It makes me think of that
Right.
sort of principle. So you have quite you have a sharp awareness of where the ball is and where the club is without necessarily looking directly at it.
Right.
Mm. And is that something that's purposely developed, or does that just sort of happen over time with hours on the course?
I think just intuitively with time. And I think a lot of it is just, you fail at something and then you try to grasp at straw to figure out what else is going to work. And I'm sure at some point people spiral enough to be like, where am I looking? Maybe I should try and look in somewhere else. And I don't think, everyone is like that. I'm sure there are some people that do like to look at a spot on the ball and then everything else is secondary, but that's just kind of where I felt like I've putted the most effectively, just because I think if I just focus on the ball, I get too wrapped up in what my stroke is doing. Especially in putting, like the stroke is so overrated. Like anyone with a little bit of athleticism should be able to hit a ball like 6 inches on line. And that's all you really need to do with a putt. So,
Now that makes a lot of sense. It really does. Even just the fact of it, just purposely opening up your peripheral vision is actually a very
right.
calming thing to do. So it calms your nervous system down.
Right.
Hmm. Did you do any specific visual training, like eye exercises?
No, a lot of it was we'd use the chalk pen to like put out dots, and then we would pick like a straight one and do some dots along the line. And then we would do like a big right to lefter and a left to righter. Because 99% of putting is just matching up your line and your speed, because it can be different. You can make a 8-foot putt on like 5 different lines depending on how hard you hit it. Like you could drip and dye something in, or you can hammer it and like not put as much break. So a lot of it was that, like some green reading exercises. But yeah.
What's your biggest fear in golf?
My biggest fear in golf? Ooh, that's a good question. I think maybe like this is slightly irrational, but I was playing in the British Open one year and a girl I was playing with hit a volunteer with a drive like in the head. And we heard it from like 250 yards away, and there was blood everywhere. And he ended up being fine. And he was actually like, oh yeah, I like my head bumped it over there, and like his head was bleeding and he had a towel to it. And he apparently, I checked on him that night and he came back the next day to volunteer again. But like that, I think that scares me so much. And, in professional golf, when there's a lot of spectators, they kind of line the fairways. So it looks very narrow, and it looks like if you hit it offline, like you could kill someone. And I think that's definitely my biggest fear in golf.
What's your biggest fear in surfing?
Huh. I don't know. I'm not like a fearless surfer by any means. Like I don't like going out in big or tough conditions. I do think there was one. So we live really close to the Mexican border. So my friend Kat and I like to drive down and surf like Rosarito and Ensenada and stuff. And it's not like super safe. There's no lifeguards or anything. And there was one day, and this was when I was early on in my surfing career and like didn't have any ocean knowledge at all, where we were kind of surfing, next to this cliff, and it was like super high tide and there was a ton of swell. And like some of the fishermen had put out all these lobster traps, and I wiped out on a wave and I got my foot like tangled in the rope around the lobster trap. And I think that's maybe the most scared I've ever been in the water. But since then I've learned I've learned not to go out at super high tide with a ton of swell if the waves are breaking right against the cliffs.
Yeah. If you could only play golf with one club, what is that club?
One club. Am I like just for enjoyment, or am I trying to shoot a good score?
If there's a different answer to both those versions, I'm interested to hear both.
Well, I love putting. It's my favorite part of the game. Like I love, all the intricacies of it and stuff. So if there was only one part of the game I could do, I would just putt. But I think if I was trying to shoot a good score, I would probably take like a 7-iron, because I feel like I can hit pretty much any shot I need to with that. And you can always putt with it too.
Yep. Okay. What's your favorite surfboard?
Much like golf, I'm not someone that owns like a ton of boards. I have 3. I have like a 9.4 nose rider. I have like a 8.2 egg, and I just got like a 7.2 egg. Right now, it's the 8.2 egg. It's a Josh Hall, who's like a local shaper in San Diego. And when I actually bought the longboard on Craigslist when I first got into surfing, and that was a Josh Hall, and I loved it so much that I contacted Josh to get the egg shape. And he was asking me all these questions like, do you want a tri-fin? Do you want like speed egg? And I was like, I don't know, but I want it to be the purple that the eggplant emoji is. And so that's the color.
Oh, shout out to Josh. Yeah, I've got one of his boards. It's one of my favorite boards.
Love it.
Yeah. That's a good approach though. Just have 3 boards. I mean, so many surfers just own too many boards and make it too complicated.
Yeah. And I think, like even with the boards, I'm sure if you're really, really good, like you can sense all the intricacies when you go surf. But for me, I need like a board when it's really small, like a board when it's like super fun, and then, a board where I'm like, all right, if I'm gonna have to, get out there and I need to get out past the whitewater, like this is gonna help me without getting bashed up. Like that's the only way I make my choice.
How many sets of clubs do you have?
So I probably have, I mean, I've given away a ton of them because I'm not a hoarder or anything, but I think I've probably had maybe 30 sets of clubs in my lifetime. I've probably given away like 15 to 20 of them. But I think for me, it's not like I don't replace full sets. I'll have like 15 putters and then 30 drivers. Like I'm kind of replacing them one by one in the bag, depending on, sometimes I would keep, you're only allowed to use 14 clubs during a tournament, but I would keep 16, and based on what kind of golf course we're playing, I would switch out clubs. But so I end up having like 100 wedges because, a lot of that is very turf dependent. So.
Okay. Is that common? Do some people go overboard with clubs? They have like multiple different sets for different courses, and can that be a disadvantage?
I think most people keep the irons pretty much the same, but yeah, with wedges, especially on the professional level, people are switching those out a lot. And also with wedges, because it's so spin dependent, you always want fresh grooves. So wedges, I was actually probably replacing at least once a month. And then like the driver, pretty much anytime a company came out with a new model, I would just like ask them to try one, because driver technology is changing so quickly that it actually does make a difference if you have the latest and greatest model in your bag. But then putting is so intuitive and feel based. Like you could putt with the same putter your entire life. So I think I've only putt with maybe 3 or 4 different putters in my career, like in competitions. But like wedges, I probably have. We use them as like door stops, and like we use them to like change the vents on the air conditioner and stuff.
Funny. Have you ever been to a wave pool yet?
I haven't. I'm not sure I would like it. I think I would feel a lot of pressure.
You'd be used to the pressure though.
Maybe, but I think I have a feeling that I did have a friend actually who used to work for Surf Simply, and they did a wave pool trip, and she was saying she played volleyball at the college level. So she was used to like pressure and competition. And she said the hours leading up to like going to the wave pool, she felt like she was at a meet. She was like, it was
Oh, wow.
the tension was just.
Yeah, I suppose everyone's watching and it's your turn. Yeah. But pressure makes diamonds, they say.
And I do kind of like the idea that if you miss it, there's someone that can pick it up. Like it never goes wasted, right? There's always like a second or whatever person who could like pick up whatever you miss. So that makes me feel a little bit better.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's kind of like the driving range for surfers.
Yeah.
Yeah. And they're popping up everywhere. So yeah, I think it's gonna change surfing for maybe for the better. We'll see. All right. Well, Tiff, thank you so much for taking the time to do this. It's awesome. If there was one piece of surfing advice you could leave listeners with, what would that be?
I think just going back to consistency over intensity. I wish I could say, I know everyone says like the best surfer in the water is having the most fun, but the person having the most fun is like probably the person who's getting better and seeing improvement and being encouraged. I'm going to go with consistency over intensity. Like put in 20, 30 minutes consistently rather than, 5 hours every other month.
Yeah, no, I like that. And I think there's a lot of truth to that saying, the best surfers having the most fun. Obviously, outside of competition surfing, because that's different, I don't think surfing is even a sport.
Sometimes I don't think so either.
Yeah.
More of a sport than golf, though.
Well, yeah. Yeah, if you can, a sport you can do in your pajamas with a cigarette hanging out of your mouth, maybe it's not a sport.
And a beer in one hand, yeah.
Exactly. Oh, Tiff, what's your Instagram so people can follow along?
So my Instagram is Tiff Joh, TIFFJOH. It's like 90% tacos, but if you're into that, it might be interesting to follow.
All right, cool. I'll have links to that in the show notes. Again, thank you so much for taking the time.
Awesome. Thank you.
And feel yourself drifting down.